Good evening. I'm Father Joseph Appleyard, Vice President for University Mission and Ministry here at Boston College, and I'd like to welcome you to one of a series of presentations offered in Boston College's Church in the 21st Century project. The Church in the 21st Century project focuses on three broad topics: the roles of laity, priests, and bishops in the Church, the challenges Catholics face in living, deepening, and handing on the faith to future generations, and a contemporary understanding of sexuality in the light of Catholic tradition. I'm here because I'm chair of the Committee on Public Lectures, and one of our projects this year has been to sponsor a series of 4 presentations on sexuality and the Christian tradition. The first, early in March, was an introduction to this topic. The second was a presentation on marriage. It was called Why Get Married? And the third was on celibacy in 3 different religious traditions. And this evening, we have a presentation entitled Homosexuality in a Catholic Context: What Has Been Said About It, What Else Can Be Said? This topic has drawn a lot of attention lately. For some, it is at the root of the sexual abuse crisis. But it has also been a focus of attention on the Boston College campus for a different reason. For some time now, there has been a discussion about organizing a support group for gay students. And that discussion ended a week ago with the approval of a group called Allies, a gay-straight alliance whose purpose is to offer educational programs on the topic of homosexuality and support for students coming to understand their sexuality. A lot of the credit for bringing this long discussion over a number of years to a conclusion, a successful conclusion, is due to Adam Baker, the outgoing president of the undergraduate student government, and to Peter Marino and some of their colleagues in the undergraduate student government. I know Adam is here tonight, and I'd just like to recognize him. Adam, where are you? Here he is. I recall the remark of a friend when I mentioned that we were organizing this series on sexuality, and I asked him for suggestions about speakers. And he said, anyone who thinks that all the questions about sexuality have clear answers probably doesn't have anything to say that's worth listening to. Sexuality is a profound mystery that we live daily, and its religious significance is profounder still. My hope is that this evening's conversations might provide some more nuanced understanding of a topic where stereotypes and half-truths and slogans abound, and that it might lead us to a richer sense of who we are in relation to the loving God who made us. Tonight we have 2 speakers. David Morrison is a writer and editor whose work has appeared in New Covenant magazine, the Catholic newspaper Our Sunday Visitor, the British Catholic Weekly, The Tablet, U.S. Catholic, the New York Post, the Washington Times, and the Baltimore Sun. In addition to writing on issues of faith, identity, sexuality, and culture, his work has dealt with human rights, third world development, health care, and population control. More immediately, for our purposes tonight, he is the author of a 1999 book, Beyond Gay. Andrew Sullivan is a writer, newspaper columnist, talk show pundit, and web blogger. He was the youngest editor-in-chief of the New Republic in the journal's history. He has written on a number of topics, including race relations, affirmative action, health care, and popular culture. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. He currently writes a column on American politics for the Sunday Times of London. He is the author of 3 books: Love Undetectable, Same-Sex Marriage, Pro and Con, and most recently, Virtually Normal, an argument about homosexuality. The most recent books of both these authors are on sale in the lobby, or will be after the presentation, and both authors will be agreeable to signing copies of those books. So that will take place out in the lobby. Both speakers are Catholics. Both could be described as having been gay activists, both, as the titles of their recent books suggest. But as the titles of their recent books suggest, both have taken different paths. The insight they can offer into the topic of homosexuality in a Catholic context is what we have come to hear tonight. Please welcome David Morrison.
Thank you, Father. Whoa, come closer. All right, great. When I mentioned to a friend of mine that I was coming to do this tonight, he replied, "Oh God, are people still talking about that?" And he predicted that 15 people would show up. And I want to thank you all for being more than his prediction. If you'll bear with me, when I've taught this before, I always find this a strain to some extent. I've asked my audience to join with me briefly in a moment of prayer, if that'd be okay. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. The Father, Son, and Spirit. Thanks. In the Gospel of Mark, the 10th chapter, the evangelist records a young man running up to Christ and kneeling before him and asking, "Lord, our good teacher, actually, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus' first answer to him is, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God." His next answer to him is to enumerate what I might recall as the party line. Honor your father, your mother, keep the commandments. The man replies, "I've done all these things since my birth. I've done all these things. What else do I need to do?" And the evangelist records that Christ looked at him and loved him and said, "Go, sell your possessions, give money to the poor, and come follow me." And he records that the young man went away sorrowing because he had a lot of possessions. And I wanted to open my talk tonight with that particular aspect of the gospel because every one of us in this room, no matter what degree of same-sex attraction we might or might not live with, no matter what our temptations might be, whatever our weaknesses might be, whatever our difficulties, ask Christ the same question. And every one of us has to hear his answer in our own lives. And it's significant because I think that's the what else can be said about it part of this topic, because it's not talked about enough. The context of what the church teaches about homosexuality. I'm a convert to Catholicism. I'm a convert to Christ, first of all, and a convert to Anglicanism first, and it was an Anglican who baptized me, and a convert to Catholicism after that. Came to the church's teachings on chastity actually before I became a Catholic, because to me, and where I was, it made so much sense given the rootedness and the questions I was exploring as to what love was. So all that's part of what I'll talk about. I'm going to presume that most people in the room know the basics of the church's teaching. That she doesn't claim to know the origins of same-sex attraction in men and women. That she doesn't declare that the attraction itself is a sin. She does declare that in a philosophic way it's an objective disorder, but by itself that's not sinful, and people do exist and live with other types of disorders all the time. So by itself, it's not something that people can be condemned for, I guess is my point. That she expects men and women living with same-sex attraction to live chastely. That just as she expects all Christians not married to live chastely, which means no sex outside of marriage, before marriage, and she also expects that men and women in marriage to live chastely, which means they orient their sexual expression to being open to the transmission of life, and which means no artificial contraception, and that she, at the same time, keep that expression within a spectrum of sexual fidelity and commitment. What people often forget, is the last part of the church's teaching, which is the last paragraph of the catechism on the topic, where she says basically that men and women living with same-sex attraction, with the help of the sacraments, with the help of sacramental grace, with the help of friendship, can and should attain Christian perfection. Essentially, the Catholic Church's teaching on homosexuality looks at me as an adult and says, you know, you might live with same-sex attraction. You might even think of yourself and define yourself as a homosexual, but the fact is that we expect and we think that you can and will be a saint. The Roman Catholic Church looks at me and says, you can be a saint. And that's something, frankly, which is, in my opinion, head and shoulders above anything else anybody else says on the topic. Because there is a kind of determinism about this issue among people on both the right and the left. There are folks on the right who will tell me that, and have told me, that because I live with a degree of same-sex attraction, that I'm condemned to hell. That's it. Go straight to hell. Don't collect $200. Don't say to hide anybody on the way. Just having the inclination is enough. There are other people on the left who say, funny thing, you live with the same degree of same-sex attraction, poor thing. We'll pat you on the head. We're not going to ask you to do anything difficult. We consider you oppressed. But it's pretty clear that, from our perspective, that you must expect to act out on your inclinations. It would be too much to ask you to live chastely. As a matter of fact, even before I wrote the book, when I wrote an article on this topic, a gay and lesbian leader wrote me an angry note about it, basically saying that, you know, what you've written is not appropriate. That's a direct quote. It's not appropriate for gay and lesbian people. And I'm sorry, I don't agree. I don't think that it's up to anybody else to decide for a whole group of people what parts of the gospel they should or should not be given, are offered, are told about. And the funny thing about it is that both sides are talking with differently, but they're using much the same idea. It's a very deterministic idea. On the one hand, the radical right will tell me that I'm determined, that it's predetermined, that I'm going to predestined, that I'm going to hell, and the left will often tell me it's predestined that you're going to act out on your sexual inclinations, and neither one is true. And the Catholic Church recognizes that neither one is true. This is very crucial because I think that people get boxed into, people tend to be made icons of this issue. And it becomes easy for people debating it to talk about the issue and not remember that there are people with faces and lives and names behind the issue for whom this is not simply a matter of academic discussion. I came to chastity because I love my partner so much. That's why I came to chastity. At the time, I'm now the veteran, if that's a good word, the veteran of a committed relationship with another man for 17 years, I guess, this year. It's a deep friendship. It has been for almost that very first moment we met. It was sexually active for the first 7 years. And after I came to Christ, and after I came to become a Christian, and after I came to start reflecting on what the Bible taught about this, what Scripture and tradition had taught about this for 2,000 years, and what I came to understand about love, I went to my partner. I said, I love you. Can we please stop having sex? That's what I said. What he heard me say was, I don't love you anymore. Which is not what I said, but that is what he heard me say. So that started out a year, more or less a year, of us figuring out and disentangling the sexual aspect of our relationship from everything else. And what we came to understand is that what we had together as friends, all the good stuff, all the love, encouragement, honesty, affection, compassion, joy, all of that we had without the sex. We didn't need to have the sex to have that. And so that was 10 years ago, and we've lived chastely ever since. As a matter of fact, only once after that date did we have sex again. I was on the night of my birthday. We both had had a bit too much to drink. We were, at the time, still sleeping together, and not having sex, but we don't do that anymore, but we wound up having sex again, and he realized what that had meant to me, and he resolved then that because he loved me, that if this is what I wanted, then that's what he would help me do. And we haven't had that happen since. The question is, what is genuine love? Nobody really holds a brief for one-night stands. And I think a big part of the criticism of the actively self-identifying gay community focuses on the bars and focuses on the one-night stands. But no one outside of a few tremendously, fairly leftist groups that I know of really holds a brief for those types of events. What people hinge upon is love. And the allegation is that the supposition is, not even an allegation, the supposition is that if we're not allowed to have sex, then if I'm not allowed to have sex, my life must be joyless and loveless and lonely and cold. And that's just not true. I mean, I think we've got a poverty of language about the topic. When people say in English, when people say, I love you, they don't mean the same thing as when they say, I love ice cream, or I love my dog, or I love my parents, or I love my neighborhood. All of those things are different kinds of love. And yet, English lumps them all into one single term. What I've come to understand, and sort of one reason why I wrote Beyond Gay, was because is the notion to recognize the notion that erotic love is only one aspect of the love that human beings experience, and can build into their lives, and can invite into their lives, and can hold close with friends that they have, and that you can live, frankly, a life that is joyful and committed and filled with friends and filled with family that is not, and family defined broadly as family that is both by blood and family we define, without having sex. So the question kind of boils down to, on the church's teaching on homosexuality a bit, is the question of, is having sex something worth risking the kingdom of heaven over? Which comes back to the question Christ asked the young man. What do I need to do? The young man asks, what do I need to do to attain eternal life? And Jesus tells him. It's actually pretty easy. I realized when I was preparing this today and rereading the passage that I was, in my mind, I've been slipping something in. I've been saying that Christ, I've been thinking, supposing, without reading it closely, that Christ had told him, go away and sell all your possessions. Give the money to the poor and follow me. And he doesn't say that. He says, sell your possessions. He could have kept some. He didn't have to sell them all. He didn't have to give all his money away. But Christ put his finger on the one thing in his life, the one thing in all our lives, because everyone in the room is going to be different, that for us to really give up, for us to really sacrifice to make Christ the Lord in our life, would be extremely difficult and something for which we might go away sorrowing. We might turn our back and say, that's not for me. Christ, I'm sorry, you're not for me. And Christ will honor our decisions. I mean, he doesn't force himself on anybody, but he'll ask. I think that the bottom line on the church's teaching on homosexuality is that it's a matter of discipleship more than anything else. Everybody, all around me in my parishes, I'm 40 this year, all around me in my parishes there are men and women who are my age, older, a little bit, younger, a little bit. They don't live with any SSA that I can tell. They don't self-define as gay or lesbian. Yet they are no more close to being married than I am. And the church expects them to live chastely as a matter of being Christ's disciples, to make him Lord in their life. The issue is not what tempts us. The issue is how we live. So it's not a question of it's not even a question of whether or not we live chastely perfectly. I recognize living chastely is a very difficult thing to do, and I don't tend to make light of it. It's part of the discipleship process. It's just like it's hard to forgive people, just like it's hard to ask people to forgive us, just like it's hard to be charitable to the folks around us who make us mad. All of that. It's part of that whole thing. The road that we're on with the rest of the world following Christ is not an easy one, but it certainly can be done, and it certainly needs to be done if we want to follow him. So the biggest thing, I think, about the church's teaching that most appeals to me, and the part of it that doesn't get said enough, which is where I'm cluing in a bit on the question, is the matter of discipleship and the matter of sainthood and the growth in Christ. And I recognize that there are people, this is an explosive issue, that there are people in the church who are going to say bad things about it, that there are people in the church who are bigoted about it. I recognize, I've been graced not to meet very many of them, but I've met one or two priests who, after they heard who I was and everything else, would not shake my hand. That's their loss, in my opinion. But then that hurt. But that's not the teaching of the church either. They were in error in that situation. I wasn't. The growth of love that is possible in the chaste relationship is every bit as deep and profound, in my experience at least, as the love I experienced while I was having sex. There's a supposition out there that our a tendency to create everything or to see everything in very black and white terms. If a relationship, a friendship has sex in it that's not supposed to have sex in it, then the whole relationship must be bad. When I was I came to Christ as an individual. Nobody evangelized me. I came to Christ from the Holy Spirit, basically, and I found an Anglican parish, and that's how I wound up there. I found an Anglican parish out of the phone book because I'd been raised by I'd gone to Southern Baptist Sunday School when I was a kid, didn't want to go back there, and I knew I had to have a church, so I didn't know what to do. So go to the phone book, pull down the phone book, and find a parish. I'd had some good contact with the Anglican Church through an outfit called Episcopal Care and Action on AIDS, and so that's what I did. I went to the Yellow Pages. I found an Anglican church that wasn't too far away. I said, "Don't make it too far away because if it's too far away, you won't go there. You won't get up Sunday morning and drive." So I did, and I liked it. I liked the fact they knew who Christ was. I liked the fact they preached well. I liked the liturgy. I liked the Eucharist. That was all new. The liturgy was new. The creed was new. I liked that the people came to this place who knew who they were and what they were about every Sunday. So I went to my Anglican pastor, and after 6 weeks at this place, and I made an appointment with him. And I'd checked him out before him. I'd called up Episcopal Care in Action. I said, is Trinity Church one of your supporting parishes? And she says, "Oh, yes, they give us money." I said, "Oh, that's a good sign." And I said, "What about the pastor? What about Nicholas? Can you tell me about him?" He's really stern. He's one of the old school. He's an evangelical. And okay, great. So I expected to go into his office on that Wednesday afternoon and have him throw me out on my ear. Politely, because he's an Anglican, but he'd throw me out of my ear nonetheless. And he listened to my whole story up to that point, which probably did take much longer than he had slated for the appointment. Didn't ask me any questions, took notes, and asked me afterwards. Well, afterwards he said, "David, if you need me to affirm what you do in bed, I can't, because I think that's sin. But if you need me to affirm you as a brother in Christ, I can do that, because everyone who welcomes Christ is welcome here." And he meant it. I mean, within 6 weeks after that, he figured out that I had a pretty good background in Scripture, thanks to the Baptists, and put me on the education committee to run the adult ed program at Trinity. I mean, he was, people didn't come to Trinity and just become pew sitters. You came to Trinity and worked. But I was a challenge for him. I was a challenge because he had a lot of suppositions too and a lot of prejudices and everything else. And he met my partner, liked him, and it really came down to a rub when they figured out that I hadn't been baptized. Well, someone laughed, and you'd think how that happened. Well, okay, I was in the Southern Baptist Sunday School up until about age 13, and at age 13 or so, I figured I didn't want to be there anymore. I left. And I kept thinking in the back of my mind that sometime during the time I'd been with them, I started going, I was 6 or something, surely somebody had baptized me. And, but I couldn't remember. I just thought I didn't remember. Nicholas came to me and said, well, why don't you go get a copy of your certificate because we want to put it in the record. We got an audit coming up. We want everything to be, all the records to be straight. Okay. Call up the church, still there. They didn't have an answer. They didn't have a hold line or anything else. Get a woman on the phone who's got a voice just about as round and sweet as a jelly donut. And said, here's the years when it might have happened. Could you let me know? Said, oh, yeah, well, she puts it on the phone, and I'm hearing drawers pull out, hearing thump, great big books dropping. She goes back 20 minutes later. No, we have no record. So Nicholas says, okay. I go to Nicholas. I said, I don't think I've been baptized. Nicholas says, very good. No more communion for you. We'll baptize you at Easter. Start of Lent. Very educational for me because I hadn't realized up to that point how Eucharistically centered I'd become. Going without was hard. Second thing he only told me this later, was that the heat he was taking when it came closer and closer to baptize me. Like I said, he was an evangelical, and he had other evangelical pastors from other denominations that he would meet with on every few weeks or something for breakfast. They had prayer breakfasts and things. And he had shared with them, not my name or anything, but he'd shared with them that the situation, he was going to baptize me or was thinking about it, and they gave him a lot of grief. Because at the time I was still having sex. And wasn't interested in giving that up. And he didn't want to share it all with me but he wanted to be straight in his own conscience about it. So he came to me and asked me one day when the church was empty and we were cleaning up. He says, David, if I'm going to baptize you, I need you to put your whole self on the altar when I do it. Everything, including your sexuality. Make that an offering to God, and I'll baptize you. And at the time, I was pretty confident I was right, so I said, sure, I can do that. I don't mind doing that. And that's what I did. That's what I did. And I've often say, just be careful what you offer God, because you never know, what He's going to take and go with. The point is that the reason he did that, the reason Nicholas went ahead and baptized me over the objections of folks who were in his peer group, was because, as he told me later, it was very clear that there was genuine love in my partner and I's friendship, even though we were having sex. And even though by the teaching of the church and the understanding of Christianity, that was not a loving thing to do. And I'm grateful he did it. And my understanding of friendships like mine and my partners is that, and how it runs counter to the whole notion of a black and white view, is that you can have both things at the same time. I don't believe that having homosexual sex with anyone is objectively loving. I don't believe it can be. I don't believe genuine love I actually think that genuine love seeks what is best for the beloved, not merely what is convenient, not merely what feels good, not merely what reassures us, not merely what we need emotionally, but what is truly best for the person we love. And I don't think that that homosexual sex is best for anybody. But at the same time, there can be in friendships so much good and so much grace. God's love is like water. It finds a way. It goes where it will. It rises to the level it chooses to rise to. It's all friendships are a little bit damp, even if they're not totally soaked in grace. So the message, I think, on the Church's teaching on homosexuality is that everybody in the room can and should ask themselves how willing we are to follow Christ. And if we can, take his offer up. Take him up on his offer. When we hear him say to us, "Go, sell your possessions and follow me," that we go ahead and do that. That we go ahead and take the leap of faith that would take. And it is a leap of faith. But it's been my experience and the experience of a lot of people now that I know, that when they take the leap of faith, he's there to catch them. And he catches us. And he'll catch you. Thank you.
And now our second speaker, of course, is Andrew Sullivan.
Thank you. It's an incredible thrill to actually have someone to talk to who defends the church's position. One of the most remarkable facts is the church does not defend its position actively. I've never heard a homily, for example, in any church I've ever attended in almost 40 years of going to Mass, which has made the arguments that I've just heard. So I'm very grateful for David, although I think it tells you something about the doctrine that the church has remained so silent about it. And I'm also delighted that David began with Matthew and that particular part of the gospel. Of course, he makes a huge leap, logically. Jesus does not say to the man, "Honor your father, your mother, love your God, and whatever you do, don't have sex with another man." He doesn't. In fact, the Gospels, Jesus never says such a thing. We have 4 evangelists telling us what Jesus really wants to tell us. And there is not a single word in the Gospels about the subject whatsoever. He says, "Leave all your possessions." Why is it, I ask you, do we not have a crisis in the American Catholic Church about too many rich people? Why do we not have huge and fervent debates about who among us owns stocks? Why do we not have a fundamental theological argument about whether people can be rich as long as they don't act on it? You laugh, but I'm actually making a serious point. No person who sat down and read all 4 Gospels, no rational person could walk up and say, the most important thing to be a Christian is not to be gay. No one. It took a great deal of effort, a great deal of theologizing, a great deal of sometimes extraordinary rationalization to come to that particular doctrine, and now to hold it as the central doctrine upon which this church lives or dies. And I'm not exaggerating. We have had a crisis in this church in which the collapse and failure of understanding human sexuality has been so profound, it has led to some of the greatest evil that the church has ever witnessed in the molestation and abuse of children. And the doctrine, again, nowhere to be found in Jesus' words about the priesthood as such, leading to a collapse in the very people who can bring the church alive. That's how important this particular doctrine has become. David talks very movingly about discipleship. And ultimately, yes, one can look at the disciples and one sees the instruction of Jesus' disciples to give up being straight, to give up their families, to leave their wives and their children and their mothers and their fathers, to attack the family in abandoning it. That is what the Gospels tell you true discipleship is. There is no distinction in that message in the Gospels between gay people and straight people. There is an extraordinary demand that the family is not the most important institution on earth, that following Jesus is. But again, it took 2 millennia of argument and documentation and theology to make the family and fertility within the family, the ability to reproduce, the central and only licit expression of human passion, love, and sexuality. That's quite some leap, and it has brought us where we are. And to ask questions about that leap, to ask questions about that logic, is not an act of disobedience, it's an act of faith and discipleship. As Catholics, we're not supposed simply just to accept our faith. We're supposed to understand it. We're supposed to ask hard questions of it. We're supposed to find difficult answers to the questions we ask. So I want to ask some very simple questions about the doctrine. And David describes it movingly and well. It is that homosexuality is not a sin in and of itself. And when you read the Church's documents on this matter with care, you find even more dramatic statements, actually. It is regarded by the Church as innate for some. The word innate is actually in official Church doctrine, meaning born with. This is a part of human identity that the Church, the Catholic Church, as opposed to Protestant churches, at least fundamentalist Protestant churches, acknowledges is a profound part of human nature. It doesn't understand why, and I think at some level why such a thing exists is to denigrate the mystery of what creation is about. But it does say it's there. Not only that, in its documents in the 70s and 80s, even in the 1986 document written by Cardinal Ratzinger, there is the notion of a homosexual person. Not a person who does certain sexual acts, but actually a homosexual person. And those of you who know Catholic theology understand that to use the term person is to use a very sacred term about such people. Homosexuals are part of God's creation, the Church tells us. They are absolutely a part of the Church. There should be no attempt to stigmatize, demonize, smear, or hurt such people. They are to be treated with dignity and respect. I wish the church spent more time talking about that positive message that it has about homosexuals than it does. Because it would lead to a lot of easing of a certain amount of pain. But, of course, it would make the second part of their argument that much harder to be persuasive about. And the second part of the argument is, even though these people are born that way, even though this is a part of human personhood, it is at the same time something that no one can act upon in its profoundest sexual sense. It is an, quote, objective disorder, unquote, a phrase that has never fully been unpacked to my satisfaction. I think it means it may not seem like a disorder to the person who experiences it, but objectively it is. In other words, the testimony of homosexual persons themselves about their lives, their loves, and their psychology is not to be trusted. They are objectively disordered. And the church says, we're not bigoted against homosexuals. We're just applying exactly the same rules that we apply to everybody else. Namely, that the only sexual activity allowed is procreative sex within a marital bond between one man and one woman. So I asked myself, how can I better understand this doctrine? What other analogies are there in Catholic teaching in which something that people are involuntarily, something that is in itself not sinful, is always and everywhere, if it is actually expressed in its core form, a sin? This is a difficult doctrine, I grant you, but surely there must be another example, an analogy which would help us understand it better. It's not like original sin. It's not like saying we're all born greedy, but it's only bad if you covet and steal somebody else's goods, because greed itself is a sin. We start sinful. And homosexuality is not, according to the church, sinful in and of itself. So that won't work. Maybe it's like, in a more elaborate sense, epilepsy. It's a disease that when it takes over you, you might hit somebody by accident or hurt somebody or do something you didn't mean to do. But of course that's absurd. If you're literally out of control, as in an epileptic fit, and do something wrong, you're not really responsible for that. And the church insists, as I think it's right to, that a homosexual act in terms of sexuality is obviously something that one knows and does consciously and willingly. The other analogy that has been brought up is alcoholism, which many serious people who support this particular doctrine hold up as the correct doctrine. It says, look, we now know, and we didn't know before, but we now know, thanks to modern psychology and science and observation, that people do have genetic tendencies towards alcoholism. It's inherited. We're not going to blame you for that, but don't ever drink. It'll destroy you. Of course, the paradox of this is that if you're not an alcoholic, you can drink, which would mean that all these straight people are happy to have gay sex at any minute, and it'll be fine. It's just if you're gay, you can't possibly go there. On a purely logical level, it doesn't work as an argument. But at a profounder level, it doesn't work either. Of course, some people, as David has expressed, although his particular case strikes me as rather rare, giving up alcoholism allows you to live fully. It allows you to love and be a part of relationships, allows you to have a family, allows you to have a productive life. Giving up the capacity for a loving sexual relationship, for many, many, many people, I would say the vast majority of people, is a really terrible burden. It requires quite a unique amount of isolation, quite a unique amount of separation from family and family structure, of all the supportive networks that make human life worth living. It is not a liberation into a full life. It is for the vast majority, I'm not saying everybody, liberation into something that approximates a great deal of suffering. To live a life without that sexual intimacy and that love is a major sacrifice. That's why the church has likened it to being on the cross. It asks its priests, but it says of priests, give this up in order to be a priest, in order to give yourself completely to God in a very special and unique calling. It doesn't say that to homosexual persons. It says, give it up because it's bad, and we know you're going to suffer, but the suffering will enrich you. In other words, I think alcoholism as an analogy doesn't get to the core of how important and profound human sexuality and human love really is in the making of a truly rich and deep human life. David's experience is a very moving one. But the story he tells begins with sexual intimacy. The relationship he has managed to build and now lives chastely started, as most relationships do, on a sexual and with a sexual component. That is what binds people together. I don't know about you, but the longer I have been in a relationship, the less sex is important. It's there, but it isn't critical. But to begin it, to bond it, to start it, to kindle it, the sexual longing interaction seems to me to be of critical importance of leading to a really deep and profound relationship. So the third analogy, and the last one, which seems to me to get at it much more clearly, is infertility. Now, this is obviously objective disorder. Human beings are built to reproduce. Yet some, for no choice of their own, cannot reproduce. Sex, the church argues, is about fundamentally reproduction. You cannot have sex unless you are open to the possibility of reproduction. So what does the church do when it greets the possibility of the infertile? If it were to be consistent, it would say, sorry, this is an act of suffering. Give up your life to the path of suffering and become a saint. If it would be consistent, it would say, this objective disorder is actually part of the cross which you must bear. We cannot allow you to have sexual relations. Does it say that? Why doesn't it say that? If you go away tonight and have one question in your head you want to answer that for yourself. Why, when the church is faced with regular people who cannot reproduce, does it say, okay, we understand. In fact, we know you can't do anything about this, but we still want to bring you within the family of the church, within the structure of the family. We still want to allow you to have marriage, the most sacred of all sacraments. We will even marry you if you're older and post-menopause and cannot possibly reproduce. So why not homosexuals, when exactly the same criteria are involved? The more you think about it, the more in church doctrine, this exception, the homosexual exception, is unique. There is absolutely no other parallel anywhere in the church's teachings for what it asks gay people to do. And the pain and loneliness and struggle to live a life knowing that this is an integral part of one's human nature and yet never be allowed to express it, even within a faithful, committed, monogamous relationship. It seems to me, at a theological level, is incoherent. At a human level, it borders on the cruel. And as a pastoral matter, and a human matter, is it possible? Is it really possible? I mean, on a one-on-one basis, on a human basis. Do people in real life separate the condition from the person who is so conditioned? Do we see any number of openly gay priests proudly, clearly, openly being gay? Because there is no stigma attached in the Catholic Church to being gay. Do we see them operating freely and openly within the Church, according to the Church's doctrines? Or do we see them terrified and frightened and closeted? And do we see them being told by every authority figure in the Church that the minute you are open about your orientation, you'll be denied preferment, you'll be shunted to one side? Of course we do. The capacity to actually love the person and condemn them at the same time is one most human beings cannot pull off. Most of us, anyway, we meet a married couple or we meet a gay couple. We don't ask them, are you having sex? This is a zone of privacy. This is a zone that we leave to them. We treat them with respect. We treat their loves with respect. Many of them may not be having sex. Many of them may have dropped that part of their relationship a long time ago. Maybe the sex has become a form of intimacy that is sometimes deeper and grows out of sex and is part of the wonders of friendship that David so beautifully described. Why can we not apply simply the same standards of respect to the human person and respect to their sexual orientation to both gay people and straight people? Isn't that, in fact, if you really read the Gospels, what our Lord was really saying? Do not single out a group of people and deny them the very basics of human dignity. Do not condescend to some people, Samaritans, or whoever the despised minority of the day is, the lepers, the marginalized. Do not, whatever else you do, regard them as somehow objectively disordered. You know, a priest, actually Richard John Newhouse, a very famous priest now, once said to me to my face, you know, Andrew, you know you are objectively disordered, and I say that with compassion. The question is, can you say it with compassion to a real gay person? Cutting through all the dogma and all the argument. Where is the real spirit of Christ in this? What is he saying to you and to me? Lastly, I want to talk about, just briefly, sex in general. Not gay sex or straight sex or whatever kind of sex, but sex. We've witnessed over the last couple of years one of the most appalling things ever to have happened to the Roman Catholic Church in America. Why did it happen? Why was the church in such an appalling state that these things went on and people couldn't talk about them, people didn't acknowledge them, and people didn't stop them? Is it, I posit, could it be, I suggest, because our church has become so fixated on sexuality, so obsessed with banning it from human experience except for an extraordinarily slim and tiny field of human experience, which even heterosexual married couples in this country cannot begin to fulfill and do not fulfill on a daily basis, has it gotten out of perspective and out of control? I answer yes. This is not ultimately about gay people. This is about humanae vitae. This is about the entire crisis in the church that began with the attempt to say that no sexual expression is valid or good or moral unless it is crudely, functionally, biologically reproductive. The reductive nature of that, the crudeness of it, with respect to the vastness and variety and depth of human sexual experience, is something that the vast majority of American Catholics, because they live lives that are human lives and they know what sex is, disagree with. Even in countries and cultures where they nominally agree, you know and I know, they practically disobey. And we have so constructed the authority of the church that the only people with actual authority to decide this are the people most conflicted and most, by necessity, repressed of anybody in the church. And they have all the power and all the authority, and we have none. And that is the truth of the matter. Whatever the Second Council said, it doesn't exist anymore. Not only does it not exist, not only can we not challenge this, we cannot even speak about it. It's amazing that we're having this conversation the way we are in an officially Catholic organization. You know how rare this is? Whatever your view on the subject, the fact that we're actually talking about it is a huge achievement. Do you know if you're a theologian in the church right now and want to write about this and think about this, or a priest that wants to actually be honest about it? Do you know what your chances are of advancement? Almost zero. And if you do, it's because it's in defiance of Rome, not in obedience to it. That is the extent of the crisis, a crisis that is killing the church over something that Jesus paid very little attention to, concentrating on the vastly more important issues of compassion, of social justice, of individual love, of the fight against bigotry and discrimination, which Jesus exemplified every day of his life, and which we look around us and find alive and well in our own church. That's the issue. It's not about being gay or straight. It's about the church allowing us and understanding the need to allow us to be human and to guide us rather than punish us in that path. Thank you.
Although we did not certainly want to structure the evening as a debate, I would like to ask David Morrison and then in turn Andrew Sullivan to, if they wish to comment, add to what they've already said at this point. David?
I think it's important to keep things clarified when we talk about this. The church doesn't teach that every act of sexual expression between a man and a woman has to be procreative. We know that doesn't happen. The witness of couples who are infertile, who desperately want to be fertile, tells us it doesn't happen. What the church teaches is that every act of sexual intercourse between a man and a woman married has to be open to procreation. That means that they cannot have taken steps to suppress the bodies that God gave them that are part of being human simply because they didn't want to take the time and exercise the patience it requires to wait. One of the most odd things about the people complaining about the church is, the church is anti-body. I'm sorry, folks, the church is extremely pro-body. The church is the one institution that's standing up for the body these days. The church is just prudish. Well, I'm sorry, but no church that I know of that trains some of its lay ministers and some of its ordained ministers to just get into intimate discussions with people about, their fertility, about measuring vaginal mucus, about basal body temperatures. Such an institution is not prudish. But it recognizes that my body was created as part of me in the image and likeness of God and has meaning. My first background was in biology. It was part of biology that got me to come to God. There's more evidence for me of God's existence in a single drop of healthy pond water than, all the philosophers around. I mean, you put that pond water under a microscope and you see some of the things that are moving around down there, and there's got to be a creator. Our bodies matter. We don't just get to suppress them. We don't just get to manipulate them. We don't just get to decide that, just because I want to do this thing, my body doesn't matter, and how I want to use my body is always entirely up to me. St. Paul knew that. St. Body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So treat your bodies with respect. The infertility argument. The fact of the matter is that, yes, that's true. The church does marry people who are infertile. And she marries people who are too old. In both those instances, she's marrying people who have something wrong with what God intended there to be. If someone's infertile, he or she is infertile because something is not working right. If they're infertile because of old age, they're infertile because people get to be a certain age and they lose their fertility. There's a seismic difference between that and between my taking my body and my partner's body, which work perfectly fine. Okay? I mean, don't get the notion that people living with same-sex attraction can't father kids or be mothers, because they do all the time. I moderate an online community called Courage Online. We have, at the last count, something like 665 souls. We've been around for 3 years. We get about 3 new people a week. We have an extraordinary number of people who are married and who are good fathers and good mothers and have a degree of same-sex attraction. Simply having same-sex attraction doesn't make you infertile. It doesn't mean your body's not working right. It doesn't mean it's impossible to do those things. There's the whole notion of I'm trying to get the right words for this. There's a whole notion that things are somehow immutable in identity, that there's such a thing as a gay person, and there's such a thing as a straight person. There are men and women who live with same-sex attraction who self-define as gay. Andrew is one of them. There are others who do so as well. There are also men and women who live with same-sex attraction who don't. When I was a gay activist back when the earth cooled, in the mid-1980s, it was fairly commonly acknowledged that people, over the course of their lives, people's sexual desires and degrees of same-sex attraction moved. It was possible to be in one period of your life, if you accepted the Kinsey scale, it was possible to be one number, and then later on in life to be a different number. And sometimes those numbers were higher and lower depending on where you were going. But it's, how you define yourself. I mean, Andrew spoke about the difficulty of defining of having the church call something that you live with an objective disorder, and then yourself feeling objectively disordered, or having somebody, and if Father Newhouse said to him that you're objectively disordered, then Father Newhouse was out of line and shouldn't have done that, because that's not what the church teaches. I live with a degree of same-sex attraction. Same-sex attraction is not me. Okay? I live with a lot of things. I've lost 100 pounds since May 31st. I used to live with a pretty high degree of attraction to food. Okay? But that did not make me that I'm a different person than what tempts me. People are more than the sum of their temptations, is my point. And that's true for everybody. That's true for all of us. I mean, there's really no difference in SSA, I mean, at a pastoral level, between someone coming into a marriage, for example, who was heterosexual and who had a long history of skirt chasing, going after a lot of women, very promiscuous. And he's making a commitment to one woman, marrying her. And that's going to be hard. It's going to mean habits are going to be broken. That's going to mean different identity. It's going to mean a lot of different things. But it can be done. It's not that sex doesn't matter, because it certainly does. It's that sex takes place in the church's mind in a context. And that context is a loving marital relationship that's open to change. When a man and woman who are not contracepting, it's very difficult to objectify someone who if you're contracepting, you've already had the conversation at some level. Maybe it's not even spoken, maybe it's just understood that I'm going to want sex when I want sex, and your position is to give it to me. And we're not going to worry about pregnancy because you're going to contracept. I try to imagine as a guy what that conversation must be like, to assume that my wife, should I be married, would, for the sake of my being able to have sex when I wanted it, would willingly, for example, put chemicals into her body that have some pretty severe side effects. I think that there's a real strong feminist brief against most contraception. Or that we'd be willing to adopt a barrier method that frankly interferes with full communion. Okay? Just because we want sex when we want it. And the point is that the marital relationship, when people aren't contracepting, you don't just take to bed your wife or your husband and your lover. You also take to bed the potential parent of your next child or your first child. You take your whole selves to bed, and you're open to the fact that God could work some really major changes in your life. I've got friends who've got little kids. My goddaughter's parents. Yeah, it's a whole different world. And yet they're open to that. And they were open to that because, we love each other, and we recognize that part of that love and expressing that love physically means being open to change. It means being open to what God's will is for our lives. So that's part of some of the thoughts I had listening to Andrew talk. Thanks.
I just have a few remarks about biology and the reference, this sort of rather crude reference to what biology is, we must be, the nature. Is there any other thing about our bodies we treat the same way? I mean, for example, Obviously, drinking is for water, is to actually hydrate the human body. That's its purpose. That's its fundamental purpose. Should we ban people drinking wine? It dehydrates you. Obviously, eating is a very important thing for the human body. But eating way more than we should, is that actually something that is as illicit as sex, which isn't directed directly towards procreation? Do you, David, consider yourself as big a sinner for being 100 pounds overweight as for having once had a relationship with another man? If your argument is from biology alone, it makes no sense at all. There's no consistency here. It's make it up as you go along. Come to the issue of sex and make up a whole new range of arguments that apply to no other part of human nature. It's not just biology, homosexuality. You're right, there's nothing actually physically, biologically wrong with me. But the church does not tell me to then go and marry a woman. It has acknowledged, it has conceded that the homosexual identity is not something you can just simply annul biologically. In fact, I think it would be a terrible sin. A much, much, much deeper sin than non-procreative sex, to deceive another human being into the very core, about the very core of your nature. That's what the previous doctrine for generations did. It helped and pushed people into marriages that were terribly destructive of the integrity and dignity of both people, let alone the children, who were also betrayed by the lie at the very basic level of that kind of relationship. It is not biology. And if the church is arguing that, it is arguing at such a crude level that it really isn't, it isn't really worthy of it. Secondly, two more little points. I agree. I don't think having same-sex attraction is the most important thing about a person. I would love to get past that. I would love people to know that I'm a writer, not a gay writer. I get absolutely tired of this. But it's not my fault. I want to get this behind me. I want this to be part of something that people just deal with and move on from, the way they deal with someone who might just be differently in many other different ways, so that they can talk about what brings us together: love, passion, family. The things that gay people and straight people have in common. Remember, every gay person, almost everyone, was born into a straight family. We have fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters. They have families. They have husbands and wives. If you're a straight person, imagine what it feels like for a young kid to grow up and at some point realize that he or she may be gay, and at that very minute is told by our church that they will never have a family like their parents. Never. Do you know what wound that inflicts upon that child? People talk about sin. Isn't that a sin? Isn't the damage that our church has done to gay people for centuries a terrible sin? Isn't the psychological and spiritual terror that people have lived under for centuries an absolute disgrace and shame on our church? I tell you this, I predict here, one day our church will apologize. They will understand more fully the awful pain they have inflicted on people who have done nothing to deserve it. People who are simply seeking to be loved by another person and are told they are evil because of it. I don't know about you, but when I read the Gospels, I know that's wrong. And lastly, David talks about the sacrifice a heterosexual man makes when he gives up a life of all sorts of possible skirt chasing for one woman, just to have one wife. Well, I'll do you a deal. If he can have one life, just let me have one husband, and I'll go home very happy.
We'd like now to give you an opportunity to ask questions. There are two microphones here at the head of each of the aisles, and I'd ask you to direct your questions preferably to one or other members of the panel. And please, questions, not statements. So we'll start over here.
Thank you tonight for both of you coming, and I really respect what you had to say. Andrew, I've been dying to ask you this for a long time. You probably run into a lot of gay activists of all kind, and the real Cancun is coming out this week. And I think if you look at our society, we really are way over the top when it comes to hedonism and all kinds of maybe misuse of sexuality. Do you think that there is a role for gay Catholics, Christians, to speak about some kind of discipleship when it comes to sexuality in our culture?
Of course. Of course. I am so grateful that my parents lived a life of almost, without betraying any personal issues, complete fidelity. I love them. I cherish their struggles. I'm very grateful for them. And I think that the one thing that gay Catholics need, more than anything else, I think, is for the Church to help us live up to the standards of our parents. But they can't do that if they write us out of human sexuality altogether. They really can't. We don't even have a place to start. We're written out of the entire conversation. We don't even have, except go away or shut yourself down. I mean, I really applaud David for at least pioneering some sort of path. But notice who did it. A gay man did it. You know? The Church didn't do it for him. The Church didn't reach out to him. He had to find it in a phone book and develop it for himself. Now, I respect his path, as I would respect anybody's sincere path. I don't think it's the only sincere path for a meaningful, productive, humane life. But the trouble is when you tell people they have nothing, when you tell people it's just as big a sin if you commit adultery in your boyfriend as if you have 5 guys in one night, if you make no distinctions at all, if it's all awful, what kind of guidance can you provide a gay person trying to live a responsible sexual life? You know, you've given them nothing. No models, no role models, nothing at all except loneliness. At least that's how it appears. So, but again, you point out this fantastic double standard. You know, the real Cancun is going on, is launched. You know, Married by America on TV. People randomly married by TV audiences. Marry a millionaire. We're going to watch on national television somebody marry someone for $1 million. But 2 gay people trying to commit to themselves? My goodness, the world is coming to an end. The only explanation for the double standard is bigotry. I've said it. That's the only explanation for that double standard.
A question here.
Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate your insights. This is addressed to Andrew Sullivan. You have an extract in Virtually Normal from Paul's letter to the Romans, and you state that this is an excerpt, is an analogy to the way in which Romans choose not to follow one true God, but persist in polytheism. The issue that I have with that is that Paul is writing to a church he has never visited and does not know personally, and for which he has only hearsay information concerning different perspectives about dietary and calendaric regulations from Gentile and Jewish Christians. Paul's reference is not to Romans, but to pagans' behavior in general regarding doctrine. Just a few more comments. You also say that the person that is by his own nature homosexual would be acting against nature by engaging in heterosexual acts. And I say that sexual orientation is never directly or inferentially mentioned in Paul's letter. And the last point.
Is there a question?
Yeah, those are questions.
Well, could Mr. Sullivan answer?
Well, I got one point, and I indulge you if you would indulge me. You state, once your analogy has been drawn, your main point can be engaged, which you present to Paul, which you represent to be that Paul regards perversion to be when heterosexuals participate in homosexual acts, and therefore homosexuals need to participate in heterosexual activity to be perverted. It seems to me that your references of Paul's letter seem to be somewhat Machiavellian. Your Roman analogy appears to be an incorrect construct, and also that many of the passages from Paul's letter indicate more to me nature as a generic rather than nature as an individual characteristic of one human being. These phrases refer to a natural, not to a qualified nature of sexual orientation of people, which is never spoken of in either Paul's letter or its criticism in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary. However, this commentary identifies that the perversion of which Paul speaks is homosexuality.
Could we
That's
let
on page
Mr.
836. If you'd like to comment on those comments.
I am very grateful for your input. I don't have anything to say.
Yes, please.
Okay, this is for Mr. Sullivan again. You had mentioned that the church officially states that homosexuality is innate, and you seem to imply that because it's innate, it's okay. But human nature is comprised of both bad elements and good elements. We have tendencies to do really horrible things, just as we have tendencies to do really great things. And that the analogies that you talked about later with the greed, epilepsy, I don't think you really got some of the best analogies, one of them being a propensity to be very violent or angry. And if a person grew up their entire childhood, they witnessed their father beating their mother, so that they have that same ingrained tendency to do that with a man with his wife, but they resist that. That is the sort of thing that we seem to be talking about here, that they may have the tendency to do it or want to do it, but they don't act on it. So that tendency is not itself inherently sinful, but acting out on it is. Can you give any comment as to how you think it's different?
That's I think, the closest to the alcoholism analogy. First of all, I think that the analogy is a little excessive. We're talking about human love here, not violence. But leave that to one side for a minute. Yes, I think there are tendencies. We all have different tendencies. Heterosexuality is also innate. It's also something that people don't choose, and it can also be expressed in good or bad ways. The question is, what exists that can never be expressed? Something that is in itself. I mean, to act violently against anybody is in itself at all times, clearly, I think, to most people, wrong.
There's such things as just war. That's acting out violently. There's things such as self-defense. That's acting out violently, and it's still not inherently sinful.
Well, I think acting out, the way you describe the tendency to act out violently is not simply the human physical capacity to inflict force. It is a desire to express yourself purely through violence. Such a thing cannot be a just war. A just war is something in which you're simply using violence for just means. Whereas the tendency to get angry, or as I understand what you're saying, a sort of hot temper, let's say, which people are born with, is never and can never be good. It's part of anger. It has its roots in a sin. Homosexuality, according to the church, does not have its roots in a sin. It is a different category. It is a condition.
Anger in itself is not inherently sinful. Otherwise, Jesus would not have walked into the temple and threw over the table. Anger can be good.
I thought it was one
well.
of the deadly sins.
It depends on how
This
it's expressed.
really is not structured to be a debate.
Well, I guess
You've asked a question, and it's fair to give people the chance to ask their questions,
All right.
too.
If you want to wrangle about that later, I'm happy to talk to you about it. But
Yeah, I have about 50 other questions.
and I'll ask about your ability to resist heterosexuality.
I'm sorry, David, but I have another question for Andrew.
Okay.
At the beginning of your first speech, you mentioned that you appreciated the church not, just saying that it's something that you're not born with, that you just choose to have those feelings, because you think it sort of represents this greater mystery, and the fact that we don't necessarily understand, why certain people have the tendencies they do, but this is part of the mystery we're sort of faced with. And it seems like in parallel to that mystery in Genesis of the way we're created and the way we are is the mystery of the revelation of the New Testament. You focus a lot on the Gospels, but it seems like, for instance, I'm not sure I quite followed the last gentleman's comments, I'm afraid, but for instance, Paul and Romans does clearly have something to say on the subject, and that while you're certainly right that systematically that's linked to a whole host of other issues like Humanae Vitae, and you can argue, the consistency of those linkages, it would seem like the better choice in my mind, and I'm interested in what you would have to say, would be to define up rather than to define down. In the same way that if a liberation theologian says, don't stop worrying about sex, start worrying about money. I'm curious why you're saying, define down.
I think basically because I've yet to be persuaded, really, of the actual harm, in terms of natural law, something that one should be pretty self-evident naturally, having experienced and seen and witnessed the actual harm of a homosexual relationship. It seems I don't see it. I can see the harm of striking a child. I can see the harm of lying to somebody. I cannot see the harm of putting together an emotional commitment to somebody and expressing it, not in some small part, because heaven knows sexuality isn't the be-all and end-all of a gay relationship. I mean, it's an absolute fraction of the time that anybody spends in a relationship. I mean, the vast majority of it is shopping, reading, and intimacy. One question I want to ask David while I'm at it is, do you share the same bed as your partner? I mean, if that's too private a question, I totally understand. But the intimacy matter does seem to be important.
And it's a valid question because we actually did for the first year, and he was the one that actually changed that because he thought that it was emotionally unhealthy for either one of us. So we stopped, and we haven't in years.
But isn't that a pretty big? I mean, for me, in my relationship, I must say, in some ways, 95% of it of the sexual component is the holding and the cuddling and the falling asleep together and the sort of the sweet intimacy of the shared bed. Now that's a huge.
There's plenty of intimacy. We don't share a bed, but there's still plenty of intimacy. Intimacy is having somebody in your life who gives a damn. Intimacy is having somebody who, if your car is broken down on the side of the road at 3 a.m., you know that you can call them and say, come get me, and they'll do it.
Right. I absolutely understand that. And I do think that friendship, and I wrote a whole essay on the importance of friendship as a human relationship. I do not want to talk about gay relationships as if they're about sex. I do think sex is an anchor for them, but I think far more important is physical intimacy as a way of expressing what words cannot, what gestures cannot, what favors cannot.
If sex is an anchor for the relationship, if sex is an anchor for love, then to what extent can you really say that you love someone? If your friend who you're having sex with comes to you and says, I love you, can we stop having sex? If at that point you walk out of his life because you no longer love him, then how much can you claim to love him from the beginning?
Well, that's never happened to me. I don't know what would happen if I did, if that was a question. It might be that it wouldn't be that huge a sacrifice as long as I had intimacy. There's another very basic biological point here I'd like to bring up, which is that human males, for example, they produce far more sperm than they could possibly deposit in a uterus, which is reproductive. Well, you laugh, and one should laugh in some ways at the crude mechanics of this. But the crude mechanics of it is the theology we live with, and that's how ridiculous it is. But yes, a 15-year-old is producing sperm at a rate that couldn't conceive. If you look at nature, that is what nature has made us. If nature is your only criterion, then people should be having sex with as many people as possible all the time. That is what our evolutionary genes have built into us. So the question is, how do we channel that sexual urge, which is natural, to good ends. And one answer is to say, stop all of it now. You can't even masturbate. Now that is a loopy standard for human beings. It cannot ever be achieved. There isn't a priest on the planet who hasn't masturbated. And I don't think he's a terrible person for doing so.
And this is what's important. What's important about this is because Andrew disparages this as being ridiculous, and this isn't ridiculous. This is part of the matter. The church stands up for the body. The body matters. Yes, it's fun to laugh at.
If the body matters, why aren't you allowing people to masturbate?
Because
when it seems
the
to be
church's
the most
teaching on masturbation is that it is a sin, but the second paragraph also talks about the fact that culpability for the sin can be diminished.
Oh.
Okay.
There's always an answer somewhere buried there.
But you don't have to do. The dichotomy you set up is to say either that everything is totally evil or it's got to be good, and that's just not the way it is. You can have things that are not.
I'm
good.
saying that it is the natural law as a tradition it tells me, and I studied it, that its basis is we look at nature and we see what anybody would understand to be true from nature. You don't need to have a developed
and they're
complicated. Let me finish for a second.
Okay.
A complicated theology to understand it. Our sexual urges are obviously probably more powerful than any other urge we have apart from eat and drink. With eating and drinking, we definitely have model goals for how we should do it, how we should behave. But we do not have the same strict bread and water diet for food and eating that we're telling people to have for sex. And we certainly don't tell some people that they can't eat or drink at all. And that's the level of asceticism we're imposing. And I just think it's unrealistic. It's failed. And not only that, but the attempt to impose it leads to terrible things. The attempt to not even talk about sexuality in the priesthood, not even talk about homosexuality in the priesthood, to force essentially people to have no sex at all, or to think of all sex as simply sinful acts rather than relationships, leads inevitably in some people to the kind of acting out and horrors that we've seen in the church. We've seen crimes committed because of this.
I'm not going to hold a brief for the way the church has addressed sexuality issues. I would be happy to have this conversation 1,000 times a year if it was venues could be found to do that in. I do think that, coming back to an earlier point you made about harm, that I know for a fact there are peer-reviewed studies that for the receptive partner in anal sex, it is harmful. Every single instance of anal sex is harmful. Every single one. And it comes back to the whole notion of, if I claim to love someone, then I don't hurt my beloved. I don't make my beloved the means to my end.
So if that's a criterion, what's wrong with oral sex? The criteria keep moving depending on what you want to prohibit. There's not a consistency here. That's my argument.
Okay.
This question's for David. For me, I don't think it's a success that BC's proud to have a gay-straight alliance. We talk about the fact that in Catholic theology as well as Jewish tradition from whence Jesus came there, and homosexuality is condemned in Jewish tradition. We know that from the deuterocanonical books, but we also have a theory of justice. And justice is not leading someone into error, not leading someone into sin. Jesus speaks of Christianity being the narrow gate from whence we walk, and broad is the way to hell and perdition. Is it unjust for Boston College or Dignity to be leading souls into hell?
Mm-hmm. Is it unjust? There were a couple of questions in that statement. First of all, I think that having some place on a college campus where someone who thinks they're coming up with a degree of same-sex attraction can go to safely talk about that is a good thing. It's probably the only thing that I and gay activists agree on, is that living in the closet, which I define as living in a place where no one else in your life knows that you live with any same-sex attraction at all, and you feel like you've got to hide it all the time, is a bad thing. Okay? With that said, places which more or less push an activist agenda that says that gay sex is good, that if you're having these feelings, you've got to act on them. It's unrealistic, as Andrew just said, to expect that you won't. I'm sorry, I don't have as pinched and narrow a view of human people as Andrew does, or seems to. I think the problem is that the problem with all these things, all these problems, this entire issue is that there is good that needs to be done, but so oftentimes there is, real wickedness that comes in here. And I mean, the church considered. Why is the church obsessed with this issue? Why aren't we? Why isn't this becomes such a big issue? Well, maybe because there's people advocating for it. I mean, I'm certain that the church would talk a lot more about adultery if adulterers got together and formed a lobby to come make a case for adultery to the church. That adultery is not a bad thing, and that the church should bless it. But that there are no such groups, and so adultery is more or less in the background, if it's talked about at all. So, I don't know. I think that it's as a lot of things in this issue is not just what you do; it's how you do it. Having somebody who is compassionate, who is open, who is gentle, who is also committed to Christ and committed to the notion that we do live a life that's not just our genes and not just our bodies, but we're both.
I know it's going to disappoint people who still want to ask questions, but we will draw this to an end. I'm sure that both Andrew Sullivan and David Morrison would be happy to talk to you in the lobby. I'm grateful.
Anybody who's got pens and paper, my email address is dcmorrison, Morrison, 58 @hotmail.com. I'm glad to answer an email.
Andrew,
and mine is andrew@andrewsullivan.com.
Thank you very much for your participation. I would guess that we probably went in directions that not all of you anticipated we would go in when you walked in the door. But I think it's testimony to the authenticity and lived wisdom of both of these quite different paths that we have, at least I would say for myself, learned something more about homosexuality in a Catholic context. Thank you very much.